9 years ago, flight MH370 went missing and has never been found. MH370 was Malaysia Airlines flight out of Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. It was a red eye flown on a Boeing 777. And about an hour or so into the flight, it just disappeared from radar, vanished, seemingly without a trace. To this day, it's never been found. At the time, it was just an enormous news story. It made global headlines. People around the world were fascinated with it. I was working at AOL.com at the time, and we had about 10 million to 13 million unique viewers coming to the site each day, and they were fascinated with the story. There was high interest in it, and so was I. But in the years since, I think it's faded from a lot of people's consciousness, people who aren't intimately connected with it. However, it's back in the headlines again because Netflix recently just released a new documentary that explores what happened to it. The movie's called MH370, The Plane That Disappeared. And I got the chance to catch up with one of the people who's in that movie. He happens to be one of the foremost authorities on MH370. He was writing about this story for Slate and New York Magazine right from the beginning. He was all over CNN at the time, so you might recognize him from there. He's written a book on the mystery. It's called The Taking of MH370. We talked about the hijacking theory that he formulated. We also talked about some of the criticism he's faced, why the plane hasn't been found after 9 years, and whether he thinks it ever will be found. Also took a look at a couple of clips from the movie and so forth. So my guest today is Jeff Wise. Thanks again for doing this, and excited to talk to you about this. And congrats on the movie coming out. I imagine things have been kind of crazy since it came out. We're recording this about a week after Netflix released the film. How's it been? How's the reception been to it on your end?
It's gotten a lot of views. It's doing really well. I looked yesterday. It was like number 2 most viewed television show in the United States. If that statistic is true, I don't know. But it's clearly, I'm getting a lot of response on social media. We were talking, the idea was floated like with Twitter, with Netflix, about me like doing an Ask Me Anything on Reddit. And my wife said, do they hate you on Reddit? I'm like, I'm not sure if they hate me. I don't go there very much, so let me go. So I kind of like dipped my toe in there. I'm like, hey, Reddit, because there was this ongoing discussion, most of which was like Jeff Wise is an asshole. He's horrible. He's a bloodthirsty vampire profiting off the suffering victim, this kind of thing. So I was like, let me dip my toe. Okay, it looks bad, but let me dip my toe in the water and see how this goes. So I was like, hey all, it's me, Jeff Wise, listen, I think there's some misunderstandings going on here. Let me see if I can clarify. And there's a kind of a dynamic that often plays out in this kind of situation where like you step into the room where everyone's been like bad mouthing you and everyone's like kind of goes quiet. And you say what you have to say, and like the first people who react are like, they were like in good faith. They're like, "Oh, thanks for showing up." It's like, yeah, I do have a question for you. And then about a little bit after that, the second wave is like the pack of angry dogs trying to rip you apart. And like, some of these people I know, they've been trying to rip me apart for a long time. So it's been interesting. So I wound up kind of like saying, okay. And so some people were like really engaging me, I think, in good faith, and were legitimately curious. And some people, I have been involved in multiple stories where people have very strong opinions, and those opinions are different from what I'm talking about. This is kind of like what I do almost. So I have kind of thick skin, I guess you could say. But
let me ask you though. Let me sure. Just stop you for a second.
Why are you going to stop me talking? How dare you? Okay.
Why are they calling you an asshole? Like I followed you, like I said, since the beginning, since the plane initially disappeared, and I feel like you've always been. Sure, I've seen some criticism. You're a conspiracy theorist, whatever.
Right.
But I never have thought that you had any malintentions, or you've always been upfront about, hey, this is a theory. This is not, I'm not saying this is exactly what happened. Why do you think there's a certain group of people that are so emotional about you.
Well, this is why I was kind of broadening it out into like topics in general. Like the internet is a place where people, I think a certain kind of person goes to be angry. And also I think that people feel an emotional attachment to their theories or to their worldview. And they get angry if you have a different opinion. It doesn't make really sense to me. I mean,
Yeah.
especially if you think about this as a scientific problem. If MH370 is something that happened in the physical world that we can tackle or approach or try to deal with through the scientific process, I think it helps to understand what the scientific process is. And I've been actually thinking a lot and learning a lot about the scientific process because of MH370. Because one of the things about human beings is that we like certainty. We don't like to think about all the million different possibilities. I did a story quite recently about chess AIs. There was a big scandal about it a few months ago. And so I talked to people who play chess, who have worked with chess AIs. And I asked them, like, and there's this idea that chess AIs are actually helping us to learn and discover about the game, because it's like almost like an alien intelligence that approaches the game from a different direction, and it sees things that we don't. And one of the things that an AI does that humans don't is AIs don't care if they spend a million years thinking about the same problem. Humans like to cut to the chase. Humans like to say, okay, what's the answer? And inevitably, when I go on most, shows or podcasts or whatever, people are like, okay, tell me what happened. And I'm like, well, unfortunately, we don't actually know what happened, but we can talk about the possibilities. And I think that's actually really useful. And so this is a very long-winded way of saying people want answers. The minute they come across a theory that seems plausible to them, they kind of grab onto it and defend it. They will fight anyone who tries to take their theory from them. And I have 46,000 comments on my blog, and most of them are people like pitching in and saying, like, this is what I think, what I know what happened to the plane. And I've been trying to create a forum where people can bring their information in, and we can kind of collectively talk about it and sort of sift out what's probable, what's improbable, what's possible, what's impossible. But unfortunately, almost every single person who comes to my blog winds up promoting their idea and doesn't really ever change their opinion.
People are very sensitive about their own theories and ideas, and they don't want to give those up or change those. But I mean, I feel like there are some things that are sort of, you can't argue. Prior to MH370 happening or disappearing, like, what was the biggest aviation story? To me, it was like 9/11, right? Maybe Air France. I mean, you're an aviation journalist, so you know this better. That's why I want to.
I mean, listen, you could have a whole discussion on that topic. I mean, I always thought Air France 447 was the most similar kind of mystery. I mean, 9/11 wasn't really a mystery. I mean, unless it was a mystery. But there were some similarities. Actually, there were some relevant points. Namely, they turned off the transponders and like were on primary radar, but like people weren't really used to looking for things in primary radar, and so they weren't sure what was what. So that was, I think, a very relevant kind of historical precedent. Air France 447, I find so many parallels between that and MH370 that I have speculated that it almost might have served as inspiration for MH370.
Really?
Particularly in the idea that, like, if once you leave behind an air traffic control sector, those people are no longer looking for you. And there's like these sort of interstices where nobody's looking at you. And what you do there is you have a certain latitude to do whatever you want for a little bit of time. Now, in the case of Air France 447, it was like many hours that it was in the sort of middle of the Atlantic and nobody was really looking at it. And it was unintentional. But with MH370, it was like a couple of, like, more on the scale of minutes, like 15 minutes, 30 minutes, something like this. But still, that gives you enough time to get hundreds of miles away from where you're supposed to be.
Air France 447, big story. 9/11, not much of a mystery, but just in terms of the use of aviation to carry out an attack, huge story. I'm talking about, like, that makes global headlines for days and weeks, like MH370 did. I mean, prior to that, I don't know. In terms of a mystery, I guess you go back to Amelia Earhart, might be the biggest aviation mystery until MH370, right? But at this point, it is, I mean, the movie kind of says it. It's the greatest aviation mystery.
I was having drinks with somebody not too long ago, and we were talking about MH370, and I was like trying to make the point that like this is a huge, like what they call it in the industry, IP. It was MH370 is a huge IP, and to prove my point, I turned to the people sitting next to us in the bar. I said, when I say missing plane, what do you think? Just missing plane. What does missing plane mean to you? And they're like, oh yeah, that Malaysia plane that disappeared. And I'm like, yeah, that's when we say missing plane, we don't mean Amelia Earhart.
Yeah.
We don't mean
Air anymore.
We mean MH370. Yeah, no.
So when it happened, what initially drew you to this? What captivated you about it? Like I said, I remember you were one of the first people I remember who was on this story and on it,
Yeah, thank you. I had kind of made a splash of sorts with Air France 447, where I was the first person to get a hold. So the BEA, the French investigative agency for air crashes, had issued a report, but it was in French, and I don't know if they had an English translation out yet or not. But there was a French aviation writer who had written a very gripping and compelling story about it in French. And I have like high school French and like Google Translate. And I basically was one of the first people to get a hold of this and read it and realize what it meant. And I did a story for it about it for Popular Mechanics, which I used to write a column for. And it caused a big stir because I basically recreated what would have been going on in the cockpit as this series of events unfolded. And it was truly tragic in the kind of Shakespearean sense, where the people were in the grip of forces, larger than they comprehended. And this very like avoidable mistake snowballed into very quickly. Like it was 5 minutes from this fairly minor, instrument failure to everyone being dead on the ocean surface. And so anyway, I wrote that piece. It got a fair bit of attention, and so I think when MH370 happened, basically what happened, the CNN needed bodies. They needed fresh meat in the trenches to talk about this, because that's all they wanted to talk about. Yeah. So basically, anyone who had even the remotest claim to being an aviation journalist was put on air. And I was one of them. And then I kind of made a stir. Well, the reason they put me on is because I wrote an article for Slate saying this plane might have been hijacked by the pilot himself.
Well, it sounds a little bit outlandish, but as time goes by and the obvious answers don't pan out, you start to have to turn to some of the more unlikely seeming possibilities. And basically what some pilots are talking about, I'm hearing, is the idea that perhaps the pilot or co-pilot of this plane took control of the cockpit, either incapacitated or killed the other pilot, locked the door, there's a deadbolt, you can lock everyone else out, turn off as much electronics as he could, dive the plane, and head out. And now it just so happens, coincidentally, that, or perhaps not coincidentally, that where this plane vanished or was last spotted was a patch of ocean where electronic communication was very poor. It's sort of a dead area between the ground stations, where if you were to suddenly turn off your electronics and make a dash for it, that would be the perfect place to do it. It might just be a coincidence, but if it was intentional, that would be the place to do it. So it would imply a certain level of sophistication on the part of the perpetrator, if there was a perpetrator. Obviously, this is all
right. But in your piece, which I thought was very interesting in your piece, was you went on to say, who would want a plane like this? Well, they're worth £37 million, and there are plenty of people in dodgy regimes around the world that would probably love to get their hands on one. So there is a huge potential market for a modern, sophisticated plane like this.
Well, absolutely, and who knows? I mean, who knows what the motive is to do something like this? The point of the piece was just to say, to investigate the question: could it be done?
And so I was one. I hadn't even remembered this till like it went, looking at the documentary and stuff. But yeah, that was kind of, and people were like, "Huh, really?" And I remember there was a term I got very excited about at the time. There's this concept in maritime law called barratry, and barratry is a phenomenon where a captain steals his own ship. And apparently it was a thing
Yeah.
in like the 19th century. Hadn't been used much. And I sort of thought, okay, people are going to, barratry is going to be like the Merriam-Webster word of the year 2014, you know, and the concept never really took off, but that idea eventually did become the mainstream consensus view of MH370. It ultimately became also the one that people make fun of me for not adhering to.
Yeah. And so the movie really focuses on three theories, and
Right.
that is the first one that is explored.
Right.
Why do you think that has emerged as the most accepted theory? And why are people dissatisfied with you not subscribing to that?
Okay, so the 30,000 foot view of MH370 is that to their surprise, the investigators found that there was this data that had been automatically recorded by Inmarsat, the satellite communications company, and that it was very unusual. It was of a kind that had never really been seen before. And when they put on their thinking caps, they realized that if you kind of invented a new kind of math, you could figure out where the plane went. And it went into the southern Indian Ocean. So there's basically three different perspectives on this. I'll call it 1A, 1B, and 2. 1A is that the data is good, and therefore the plane must be in the southern Indian Ocean. That being the case, it almost certainly was the captain who took the plane, barratry.
Right.
Part 1B is that the data is real. It was legitimately transmitted from the plane and recorded by Inmarsat, but that it was tampered with by somebody on the plane in order to make it look like it went south when it actually went north. That's my sort of hypothesis. I call that the spoof hypothesis. And if that's what happened, it was probably done by the Russians. Then there's number 2, which is the Inmarsat data is fake from beginning to end. The whole thing is cooked up. We can't trust anything. Everything is a huge conspiracy. The Anglo-Saxons are up to no good. And that's basically Florence Changi's perspective. She thinks that the Americans actually shot down the plane. So I basically, in this TV show, I explain 1A and 1B. And then Florence Changi comes on in part 3 and says 2, which is that the whole thing is fake. And so I favor 2B. And basically my mission for most of the last 9 years is to say, look, even if 2B, even I can't prove to you that 2B is correct, I basically have identified a security vulnerability. I've identified an attack vector by which this could have happened, which we should view as worrying, okay?
Yeah.
And if I'm wrong, it should be possible for the authorities to say, this attack vector is not valid for reasons X, Y, and Z. And
nobody has done that, really, right? Nobody has anyone done that?
Well, I think my detractors would say that they have done it because Mike Exner, who is an independent researcher, is on camera saying you can't control a plane from the electronics bay. Yeah, which you would have to for my theory to work.
Right.
Now, people are like, yeah, and somebody on Twitter the other day was like, well, hey, Mike Exner proved you were wrong. I said, he didn't prove I was wrong. He made an assertion.
Yeah.
And what I'm basically positing is that this is the thing. I'm positing that we are facing an adversary who is smarter than us and is also ruthless and has a very terrible agenda that they're actually carrying out. So people are like, that, how could they be smarter than us? That's so unlikely. And I feel like if your attitude, as from a security perspective, if your attitude is like, I'm the smartest person around and like nobody can outwit me, that's actually a very terrible stance to take. It's a very dangerous stance to take. There's actually a guy from Inmarsat who says, we just invented this math ourselves. How could somebody possibly have thought of this before us? This is basically the we're the smartest people, so nobody can be smarter than us hypothesis.
Yeah. Which
I, again, think is very dangerous. And something that I came to realize like only years after studying this is that while it seems incredibly arcane that somebody could alter the transmission frequency of a satellite communication signal in order to like create a false impression, for you and me, like that's crazily arcane. But we live in a very, very complicated society where there's so many moving parts. Like I can't explain how anything in my world works. Like my microphone, my camera, you know, my toaster, my fridge. My fridge has more computing power than the Apollo 13, right? There's an entire industry that is devoted, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that's worldwide, and that is devoted to fooling people with altered avionics signals, right? It's called electronic warfare, and it's very important. It's like we have air defense, and we have interceptors, and we have people who try to figure out how do you get into someone else's air defense network and by fooling them. And you know, people know about stealth fighters and stealth bombers and the idea of like being invisible to radar, but that's only part of it. You can't actually infiltrate an advanced air defense environment with just stealth fighters. You have to have what's called electronic warfare. And this is something like called the Growler, which is a plane that's outfitted with these electronic boxes. And basically it detects the incoming signals. It figures out what the adversary is trying to do, and it sends out other signals to fool the adversary. So basically, I mean, listen, we could have multiple shows on this topic exclusively, but the point I just want to try to make is this seems crazy and impossible to imagine to you and me, but there are people for whom this is like what they get up every day. They put on their pants and they think about this, just this stuff.
Yeah. And, you know, I brought up 9/11 earlier, and I think that your theory is sort of reminiscent of 9/11. Prior to 9/11, if someone had come up to me and said, here's what's going to happen. A bunch of terrorists from the Middle East are going to hijack several planes with box cutters, and they're going to take those planes. Then they're going to overwhelm the crew and pilots and fly them and crash them into our biggest landmarks in the United States. I would have dismissed that, you know, summarily. It would have sounded completely ridiculous to me. But the imagination that those people had, however bad they were, however bad that intent was, they had imagination beyond what really we were thinking, right? And couldn't the same be true here?
You know, I've been thinking about this for 9 years, and what you just said is something I hadn't even occurred to me, but I think is profoundly true. You're absolutely right. And to which I would add that, speaking only for myself, the overall impression I had in the first week after 9/11 was shock, incredulity, an inability to like get my head around what had happened. And all the people I were talking to, it wasn't just like sadness at the death of these people. It was more like horror at the realization that like we didn't actually understand how the world worked. Our entire model of the world had been ripped apart, and all of the authorities who were supposed to be in charge of like making sense of this world and controlling the world and being the grown-ups who were like, you know, telling us how things worked, were wrong. We're like completely incapable. We're not up to the task. So this incredible sense of cognitive dissonance, which you're right, is so similar to what I'm fighting with MH370. And if you can imagine a situation like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, where something epical and a sort of, as I say in the documentary, like a rip in the fabric of reality. 9/11 was a rip in the fabric of reality. Like we were forced to confront, you know, these things that were the tallest buildings in New York City were now a massive pile of rubble, and everyone in downtown was covered in dust.
Yeah,
there was no, you know, you couldn't deny it. You could not deny it. And so MH370, on the other hand, is something that's potentially as epical, as much of a rip in the fabric of reality. But there was nothing. There was some numbers that you have to do this crazy math to even get your head around. So what would imagine if this is like almost like a Zen koan, but imagine 9/11 without the towers going down.
Yeah.
That's almost what it's like. Yeah. Great analogy. I never thought of that.
And just to really quickly summarize your theory, it really involves somebody sneaking down below the deck and manipulating some electrical systems in the plane that even the pilots are unable to do, you know, something the pilots are not trained to even do or even want to do.
Right.
But he would
Right.
do that and then essentially fly the plane from a laptop until the flight crew was overwhelmed,
Right.
and so forth. So
Yeah.
when I was watching it, I was like, this sounds a little crazy. But then I was like, wait a second, something crazier actually happened just 13 years before.
That's a really wonderful point. And the thing about electronic warfare or hacking, it's about people getting really, really, really in the weeds about incredibly complex systems and doing stuff that even the designers of those systems didn't envision. The idea of a 0-day hack. And like you think about Stuxnet, right? Where Israeli intelligence or American intelligence, I don't know if it's been definitively settled, but some hostile intelligence agency got someone to stick a thumb drive into one of the computers in the Iranian, nuclear material separation facility, and somehow the software was corrupted and like spun the centrifuges too fast and destroyed all the centrifuges. It's like it is. I mean, this kind of thing. This is what I think is really important to understand, and so hard for people to understand, is that we live in a world of such tremendous complexity. It's really beyond the ability of the average human mind to grasp. And things that seem crazy happen really all the time, and we need to worry about them happening. So, yes, the 1 in a million thing is exactly where the people who do this for a living, they're looking to do that 1 in a million thing. They're going around, and like, in the old days, the burglar would go around and like jiggle the doorknobs to see if somebody had forgotten to lock their door. Now we can do that, sort of in the electronic space, with bots, and you can do that a million times a
remotely.
second. Find that vulnerability. If you understand the system, you can harm it in like really clever and creative ways.
Yeah. And then so your theory also sort of hinges on a motive related to Ukraine.
Right.
Talking about just geopolitical history at the time, Russia was in the midst of annexing Crimea. And that was really the lead story for the first quarter of that year, up until MH370, right?
Well, it wasn't a quarter of a year. I mean, it was just like the weeks immediately preceding MH370. Did Russia do its plan with little green men? And obviously you don't just like little green men don't just pop up overnight. You have to spend at least months planning this kind of, it was a combination of what they call kinetic warfare, like tanks and guns.
Yep.
And intelligence operation, where you're like trying to fool, deceive, mislead. For a long time, Putin was like, oh, I don't know who these little green guys are. Could be anybody, really. It's probably just the locals are getting angry. Then later he admitted, of course, it was, Russian military intelligence or whatever. But so, yeah, I mean, I think the important point I try to make is that, listen, I can't prove that theory 1A is correct, but I will say that the possibility that it might be correct made me feel really worried. It made me feel really worried that we're facing a very sophisticated and very dedicated and very ruthless enemy who intended to basically undermine the entire world order as it stood. I mean, the motive seemed to be to try to, if Putin is a guy who wants to cement his authoritarian grip on power at the expense of his people, to kind of immiserate his people so that he could hold on to power, his motive was to make to undermine democracy around the world seem less viable, less desirable. And so my fear was that we were going to be attacked by this very sophisticated, an adversary so sophisticated that we didn't even grasp, couldn't even get our heads around the act that he was attacking. So we were effectively like dodos, on Mauritius when the sailor showed up and just started clubbing them over the heads. The birds were like, I have no idea what's happening, but I have a really bad headache all of a sudden. That's what, and so that was my fear. And that is exactly what transpired. It was 2 years from MH370 to Russian intelligence subverting the United States presidential election with the illegal participation of the Trump campaign, to put this unpopular politician over the top and put him in the White House, where he proceeded to like be Putin's best friend, to say that he trusted Putin. trusted Putin over his own intelligence services to then, he said, oh, in China, they have a leader for life. Wouldn't that be great? And then he tried to, he engaged in a coup d'etat. And he's still the coup d'etat is still ongoing. His collaborators in the coup now control half of the United States government. There are now seditionists in charge of the House investigatory panel looking at the sedition. Their seditionists are now investigating the sedition. So I don't know if Putin is actually going to win this war. The war is still going on. So whether or not I was right that MH370 was the start of this war, the war happened. So I feel a little bit like, I don't know, that figure, the Cassandra from the Trojan War, who tried to tell everyone, look, this thing is going to happen, and everyone's like, poo, poo, poo. And so, I mean.
So you think that MH370 was sort of like a first salvo or early salvo in what's been this ongoing really attack, I guess. That's what you think, by Putin on the Western world?
I do. I think that MH370 was our modern Pearl Harbor, but like minus all the sinking battleships. Again, it's like an invisible Pearl Harbor. Like people could not, imagine you could do Pearl Harbor and like take out half the Pacific Fleet without the Americans even realizing it had happened. That's what MH370 I think was. So
I want to ask you about the U.S. role in the investigation. Right. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that my memory, according to what I recollect, the U.S. did not really take a leading role in it, apart from grabbing the pilot's flight simulator that he had in his home. Is that correct? I mean,
yeah, but this is very typical. See, when you do an international air accident investigation, there's the lead investigator, and there's various rules as to like who takes the lead. Like in the case of MH17, it wound up being the Dutch because the plane had taken off from Holland and most of the passengers were Dutch. So in this case, it wound up being Australians because it was believed that that's where the plane crashed.
Because it was in their airspace, because it crashed in their airspace.
It was believed that the final, debris field was in waters that were under the responsibility of Australia's search and rescue agency. So it was typical that America played a supporting role. There were some passengers on board from the United States. The plane was manufactured in the United States. So and also just the United States has a lot of investigatory capabilities, and so the Malaysians wound up, as I understand it, giving the hard drive to the FBI. I don't really know. I actually broke this aspect of the story, but like it's all a little bit hazy in my mind because I didn't really think it was. I don't really remember that well because it was like to my mind like not really very dispositive one way or the other. But I just spent a fair bit of time. Like I got my father-in-law's old PC, and he actually had the same version of Microsoft Flight Simulator that Sahari did. So I actually played around with it and tried to get that same data set to be recreated, but. To make a long story short, I don't see anything particularly unusual or nefarious about the fact that the FBI was involved or that they haven't been willing to release any information. I filed a FOIA report back in the day, and they answered it pretty expeditiously, saying, "This is an ongoing investigation, so we're not going to tell you anything." I thought that was interesting that they consider an ongoing investigation.
When was that? When did you make that FOIA request?
I'd have to look it up. It's all, I mean.
Like years though,
somewhere like 2016 or like that.
Oh, so you're talking like at least 6-7 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I could do it again, but I'm not optimistic enough.
Yeah, I understand. It just struck me as odd that the FBI would be brought in there.
It's not odd.
That's not odd. It's because that's in terms of policing. Or investigate,
people, like matters. For instance, like a lot of times when a black box, like a lot of investigations involve black boxes, right? And there's some countries that don't like the United States, and so they might go to France. They might go to, I don't know, I forget who's like what the league table of black box experts would be, but yeah, you kind of go to whoever you want to go to that has expertise that you think you lack.
And they basically concluded that the pilot had previous to the missing MH370 flight, had run a similar course on that simulator, and thereby was like sort of practicing.
No, they did not. They did not. Well, okay. They found these partial records of a flight that he had done like 3 or 4 weeks before, so fairly in the same time frame as the accident, where he had flown up the Malacca Strait in the same direction as the plane was seen on radar doing, and then it was kind of manually sort of clicked and dragged down into the Southern Ocean. The fuel was set to 0, and then he seems to have like tried to like glide, like almost like a fuel out scenario. And he did it at a high altitude and they did it at a low altitude. And so it's, you know, you can look at it and say, oh, this is kind of exactly what he wound up doing, like flying into the Southern Ocean until fuel exhaustion, and then gliding it into the ocean. And I actually find that that's a very plausible interpretation on its own, right? But there's other things to consider. One is that after he did that flight, he flew other flights. Like he flew like a DC-3, which is a kind of a historic aircraft that you might fly. Like one of the appeals of like a Microsoft Flight Simulator for a pilot is like, oh, I wonder what this old plane, I wonder what a Wright Flyer flies like. I wonder what a, you know, World War II fighter plane flies like. You get to fly around different planes. So this guy was like fooling around with different planes that obviously had no bearing on this. Like, which to me mentally, I find I have a hard time getting my head around. Like, if you're about to kill yourself and 239 of your passengers, which is no small thing for a pilot, by the way. The idea that you're just like, oh yeah, I'll see how to like carry out this murder suicide, and then I'm just going to goof around with the DC-3.
Right.
It's like, really? You're like that lighthearted about it? You're just kind of goofing around.
Yeah.
I find that really weird. The other thing to bear in mind is that there are other kind of historical precedents of, like, if he set the fuel to 0 and then tried to glide it, and you could say that's like a guy committing suicide, or you could say like maybe he's wondering if he could do what Sully did over the Hudson. Sully lost his engines and had to glide into the water, so maybe he was doing that, you know. And then there was also been historical antecedents of people like, you know, losing, like running out of fuel at high altitude and having to glide. Yeah, that has happened before. It was actually an awesome aviation story called the Gimli Glider, which I'm amazed hasn't been turned into like a movie. Yeah, you know, you brought up Sully. Actually, that was a huge story too. What was that? I think 2008 that happened on the Hudson River. Something like that. I think it was 2008. I don't know. They made a movie about that, but they should a better story. The Gimli Glider was like Sully times 10. It was a much better story. But anyway, yeah, Sully was famous. I mean, listen, if you're going to pull off an amazing feat of aviation, it doesn't hurt to do it like right next to the world's major media market, right? Yeah. Oh, I mean, that was amazing. There were surveillance cameras on that. The media were right over there within minutes. Yeah. You can have video of it, man. Yeah. So those could have been some other explanations for why he was running those flight paths and why he was doing it with no fuel and at different altitudes, right? He could be practicing for a water landing. I mean, my take home from the whole flight simulator thing is that it makes it on the balance, it sort of shifts. I would consider it evidence in favor of pilot suicide scenario, but it's not dispositive. And so if we're trying to solve the mystery and we're trying to say it was definitely this or definitely that, I don't think it doesn't end the story. It's not what, you know, I think Mike Exner says people were hoping it would be a smoking gun. And, you know, to his credit, Mike was a big advocate of the pilot suicide theory, you know, didn't take the win. I think that he could have if he wanted to. So, yeah, that's my take home. It's evidence in favor, but not dispositive.
And as far as pilot suicide goes, that this is not totally unprecedented either. It's happened before, and it happened even within about a year after, right? With the German wings
Yeah, the
crash.
German wings pilot was a young guy who crashed his plane into the Alps, and he was later found to have searched for MH370 pilot suicide or something on like Google or whatever on his iPad. So in a way, it just kind of shows you the power of a theory. Just the fact that that thing was discussed actually inspired a guy to do it.
Yeah. And do you know, has there ever been any sort of like psychological profile of what would, cause a pilot to do something like that? I mean, suicide's one thing.
Yeah, I
taking
mean,
down a whole plane full of passengers, innocent passengers, is, that seems like another step beyond.
yeah, I mean, I addressed this. I actually wrote about this on my blog. And by the way, I would encourage people who are interested in this, if you really want a quick grounding in the basics of this rather complicated case, I would encourage people to get a copy of my book, the Taking of MH370. It kind of really tries to run through the basic facts, as expeditiously as possible. And I've also kind of dived more deeply into some of these questions on my blog over the years, jeffwise.net, and people can ask questions too in the comments. There's quite a lively discussion going on right now. Yeah, I did a blog post about the psychology of suicide, and the human, by the time, it's just such an irrational seeming act that it's hard to sort of say, oh, this, I said to this woman who specializes in the psychology of suicide, I said, like, has there ever been like so the thing that really struck me about this case, it seemed to make it unlikely to be suicide, is that it was so long, so protracted, and so complicated. Like, you had to be really motivated. It was very aggressively done, and like super subtle, and like just the fact that this box was even turned on required motivation and knowledge.
Yeah.
So I said to this psychologist, I said, like, and I had always thought that people who are suicidal are just like so depressed, they just want to get it over with. Like they want out. They don't want to, like, dance the nutcracker and then kill themselves. They just want to, and so, and indeed, most of the cases we have of this sort of thing happening, it's like the person puts it just into the ground as quickly as they can. In the case of German wings, he set the autopilot for 0 feet and just kind of sat there while the plane descended into the ground. So I said to this woman, I said, have there ever been cases of really complicated suicide? And she's like, yeah, actually, there was a case where a person like built this kind of suicide machine with a chainsaw. I was like, all right, God, don't even tell me anymore. That's enough. Yeah. So apparently it does. I mean, the thing, and her sort of take home was that, look, the human mind is complicated, and it can do things that seem irrational and kind of inconceivable to outsiders.
Yeah. So it's not unprecedented, but it sounds rare for something that elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're talking the whole case is involving black swans, so it's hard. We can't. When this thing happened, and in the years since, like the phrase that people keep coming back with, like Occam's razor. Occam's razor, the simplest solution is best. And the thing I try to say to them is, like, I understand the appeal of simple solutions. In this case, we can rule them out. We know that what happened in MH370 was not simple. It was weird. It was a black swan thing. When we find out ultimately what happened to this plane, we're going to be like, oh, really? I mean, when we found out what happened to Air France 47, nobody had predicted what happened to France 447 until we decoded the black box and heard what they were saying. People were like, really? That's what happened? That's crazy. So, like, a sense of humility, like we should be, prepare, expect the unexpected, I guess, as they say.
Yeah. And none of the theories are simple.
That's right. Even the pilot suicide is incredibly complicated.
Even the simplest is not simple.
Exactly.
Do you think that it'll ever be found?
I do. If we can find the Higgs boson, we can find a 210-foot long plane. But we have to take it more seriously than we've taken it. The sense of complacency and certainty, this kind of smug sense, the kind of mindset that says, "Oh, you can't control a 777 from the EE Bay." It's like, okay, if you want to make that assertion, let's dig into it. Like, tell me why you can't. It's like, let's not just the killer of this thing has always been assumptions. The assumption. I read so many stories about how, like, oh yeah, and they left the SATCOM on. I'm like, you're assuming they left the SATCOM on because the SATCOM was on. That's an incorrect assumption, an important incorrect assumption. So yes, enough of the assumptions. We have to break down everything down to bits.
So you think it'll be found, but what is it going to take? I mean, to take it more seriously, there's no one's even looking for it right now, right?
Yeah, I think they need to have like a blue ribbon panel like they did after the space shuttle blew up. They need to get some serious independent scientists. The people who failed the first time cannot be counted on to assess their failure. We need fresh blood, and probably like even go beyond Australia, make it an international panel. But there needs to be a panel. People need to want it. People need to ask for it. People need to think it's important. People don't have the smoking rubble of the Twin Towers, but they just have to realize that this is important.
Right. So finding the plane would go a long way to solving what actually happened.
Said it would solve what happened. I think it would solve the problem.
Yeah, because presumably you find the black boxes. Would the black boxes even be viable at this point?
I mean, I imagine, but just even like if they did, find the plane on the seabed, like that would kind of, I think, it would all be just like mopping up the details, I think.
Yeah. In your last, most recent article for New York Magazine, you said that we could pressure the Malaysian government to finally release all the evidence in its possession, including the full set of military radar returns showing the plane's last known track. How do people do that? Are you talking specifically to the people of Malaysia? Or are you talking to an international coalition here?
At the time that the plane disappeared, people said, "Oh, the Zahari was a fan of this opposition politician. He was probably a crazy, anti-government guy who just wanted to create as much havoc as possible. Blah blah blah. This guy was a crazy opposition politician." That opposition politician is now the Prime Minister of Malaysia. So why is it the opposition should just say, okay, previous government, we're going to dig into what you did. They haven't done that for whatever.
But would that take some pressure from like a U.S. lawmaker or some U.S. government?
Yeah, that would be great. I would love it if some U.S. lawmaker heard your podcast or listened or read my piece and was like, yeah, this is important. We should apply some pressure. I'm sure that would do a lot. I'm sure the FBI has it. I'm sure the American officials could have access to all of this data if they wanted to. I'm sure there's a lot of data. Like I'm sure there's like an entire satellite. Like what did the satellites see? What satellites were in the area? What did they detect? Blah blah blah. It's all secret military capabilities, but like you can, they told us that the Russians were going to invade. They didn't have to reveal what their sources were, but they could tell us what their conclusions were. They haven't said anything about MH370.
Yeah. Listen, I have to ask you one more question before you go.
Okay.
Could something like this ever happen again?
Yes. This is what I'm trying to say. It is happening right now. I mean, yeah. I think that the election subversion of 2016 is the same people outwitting us the same way. I mean, it depends what you mean. Like, what is this? I mean,
I'm really talking specifically about a plane. People disappearing again. I mean, haven't there been changes? Like, isn't there? I don't know if it was flight radar or flight aware. Was that technology around that? I feel like right now you could just pull up that website and see every plane that's in the sky. The first
thing that happened was they turned that off. They turned off the ADS-B. But listen, if there's a specific answer and a general answer. The specific answer is the exact vulnerability that existed for MH370 does not exist anymore anywhere. And so in that specific case, no, that will never happen again. But the same principle of like, are there vulnerabilities in air traffic control, in airplane, management? Yeah, of course. I mean, the system is only more complex than it was. And I'll tell you one more thing. ADS-B, you're talking about flight radar, that is unencrypted data. So it is incredibly easy to spoof that data. It'd be very easy to fool an unsuspecting air traffic controller that you're going one way when you're actually going the other. And we've even seen like a lot of cases since 2014 of Russia specifically spoofing GPS data to make things look like they're like, you're flying near Moscow and all of a sudden your GPS tells you that you're, over, Cairo or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is this kind of vulnerability is exploitable and will be exploited, I'm sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, you were great in the movie, and
thank you.
Yeah, I just thought great job of getting people back up to speed on this. I'm sure it's sort of faded from a lot of people's memories, but I thought even from mine, and I was very obsessed with this story. when it happened. But you kind of brought it all back. So it was great to see you in there. Really quick, for people who want to follow you, you're on Twitter. Let's just give your plugs here.
Sure. My Twitter handle is @manvbrain. You can hit me up with questions there. There's also kind of a discussion going on my website, jeffwise.net. Happy to engage with people, happy to answer questions. I mean, this is, it kind of belongs to all of us. And I think that people really need to learn about this. It's an important topic, and MH370 is not a cold case. MH370 is still happening. It's present tense.
Yeah.
And we need to grapple with it. But I appreciate you reaching out to me. I appreciate your interest in this, and I appreciate your, following me and all that. So thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, you're sort of the authority on it. So when I saw you in that, I was like, got to talk to Jeff if I can.
Yeah.
So thanks for talking. And you have the book too. So
oh my God,
get the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, the taking of MH370, it's just an attempt to kind of, lay it down, lay all the facts in a kind of easy to read format, and just kind of explain to people what they want to know if they want to try to get their head around what happened to this mysteriously disappearing plane.
Yeah. And let me just say this too. You might not like predictions, but if you had to predict, like 10 years from now, are we going to be having this same discussion, or do you think we will have found it by then?
I think our robot overlords will be having this discussion probably. I mean, I think, okay, just predict. Yes, I think 10 years from now, but I have like, as they said about Lab Leak, we predict this with low confidence.
Yeah. All right, Jeff. Well, it was great. Fascinating discussion. Great movie too. I know tons of people are watching it. Hopefully this is a little bit of a supplement to that. But thanks for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.